Isara had learned to smile through the worst of it. She smiled now, standing at the high window of Duncaro, one hand pressed flat against the cold stone sill, while the other hid inside the folds of her gown. Inside that fold, her fingers were curled tight around a square of linen, and she did not need to look at it to know the sickness had marked it again, the way it did most mornings. Now some mornings it was only a little. This morning it had been more. Below her, in the training yard, the whole of the veil mark seemed to gather itself around one man. Torin moved through the sparring line, the way weather moved through a valley, and the young warriors broke and reformed around him, and laughed when he laughed. He was enormous in the way of the old bloodlines, broad through the shoulder, quick in a manner that large men were not supposed to be quick. 7 winters as king had not softened him. If anything, the crown had made him harder to look away from. She watched the steam of his breath in the cold, and the ease in his body, and the sheer living strength of him, and she felt the familiar ache turn over behind her ribs, like something with its own slow heartbeat. He was alive. He was strong. He would outlast every stone in this keep, and she was the reason, and no one in the realm knew it, and she intended to keep it that way until the day it finished her. It did not take her all at once. That was the cruelty of the thing she had done. If it had killed her that first night, she would have died happy, a foolish girl who had spent her one life on a boy who deserved it. Instead, it took her the slow way, a little breath here, a little warmth there, a handful of years lifted quietly out of her. While she was busy pretending to pour the tea, she had learned to feel it working. On the good days, it was only a heaviness, low in her chest, like a hand resting there. On the bad days, it was the hand closing. This morning, the hand had closed, and it had not fully opened again, and somewhere down in the yard, a strong young king had woken rested and warm, and had never once wondered why. A cough climbed her throat. She turned from the window and pressed the linen to her mouth, and wrote it out in silence, her eyes fixed on the far wall, her spine very straight, the way Mabon had taught her. Never let them see the whole of it. Give them a pale Luna, a tired Luna, a Luna who did not carry airs and did not laugh often and kept to the quiet rooms. Let them make of that whatever cruelty they liked. It was safer than the truth. The truth would put a knife in Torin's hand and turn it on himself, and she had not spent 7 years dying quietly only to lose him to his own guilt. When it passed, she folded the linen small and tucked it away and breathed. The door opened without a knock, which meant it was Mabon, because Mabon had stopped knocking around the time Isora had stopped being able to hide anything from her. The old healer came in with her sleeves pushed back and her eyes already narrowed, and she crossed the room and took Isora's chin in her dry hand and tipped her face toward the light and looked at her mouth. Isora let her. There was no point in the pretense with Mabon. Mabon had taught her the binding. Mabon had begged her not to use it. "You are worse," the healer said. "It was not a question." "I am the same," Isora said. "You are worse," Mabon said again, softer, and let go of her chin. "The binding is not meant to hold this long. No one has ever held it this long. It is eating the years faster. Now I can feel it from across a room." She turned away and busied her hands with the jars on the table so that she would not have to look at what she was saying. "If you keep on as you are, we are speaking of a season, perhaps 2. Isora had known. She had felt the acceleration in her own bones for weeks, the way a woman knows the tide by the smell of the air, but hearing it said aloud in Mabon's flat old voice made her reach for the sill again. "A season?" she repeated. "Unless you cut the binding," Mabon said. "And let him take back the wound that should have killed him 7 years ago," Isora said. "Let him die on the floor of his own hall the moment the tether goes slack." "No, there may be another way," Mabon said, and there was something careful in how she said it, something Isora did not like at all. "There is old talk of the binding being carried by another, passed, not cut. If another were willing to take your place, to stand where you stand, the tether might move to her and let you go. You would live, he would live. The cost would only find a new back to sit on. Isora stared at her. No one would be willing, she said. No, Mabon agreed. No one who understood it would. Then after a pause that lasted a beat too long, the healer said, "But there is a great deal happening in this keep just now that you have not let yourself look at, child. There is a rider come up from the southern packs." She arrived at dawn. The king has not stopped speaking of her since. The cold that went through Isara then had nothing to do with the window. Speaking of her, she said, Osric announced her at the gate, Mabon said. A daughter of the sable line, strong blood, unbonded. Mabon met her eyes and did not soften it, because softening things had never been her way. They are already saying she is what Aluna ought to be. And you know how they have talked about you. I know how they talk, Isora said. Then know this too, Mabon said, and lowered her voice. Though there was no one to hear, she did not come alone, and she did not come only for the king. I helped carry in her party's baggage this morning, because these old hands are still good for something, and there was a chest in it, locked with a healer's seal, the old kind, the kind we do not use anymore in this keep because we burned the books that taught it. She let that sit. Someone in the south still reads what I read, child. Someone sent that girl up here, knowing more than a bright face and a strong bloodline. I do not know what. But I know the smell of it, and it is the same smell as the night you knelt over his broken body. Isora went very still. Below, in the yard, Torin had stopped sparring. Isora did not need to look to know why. She looked anyway. A woman had come to stand at the edge of the training ground, and even at that distance, Isora could see the sun catch her, could see how she held herself, unafraid, unbowed, whole. The men had turned toward her, the way iron turns toward a lodestone, and Torin had turned too. Isora pressed the warm linen deeper into her fold and made her face smooth and made her breathing quiet, and did the only thing she had left that she was good at. She smiled. To understand how a king comes to be kept alive by a secret, you have to go back to the night the secret was made. 7 winters before, the war had come all the way to the doors of Duncarrow. Isora had been a healer's apprentice then, a bondless girl with no name worth speaking, the kind of girl who was given the work no one else wanted, and thanked for it if she was thanked at all. She had spent that whole long night on her knees in the great hall, while the wounded were carried in, and near the middle of it they had carried in the young Alpha, who was not yet king, and she had seen at one glance that he was already gone. The wound was through the side of him, deep and wrong, the kind of wound that healers looked at once, and then looked away from, so as not to waste hope. Mabon had looked away from it, everyone had. And Isora, who had loved him from a distance the way a servant girl loves a thing she will never be allowed to touch, had not been able to look away. She had read of the death binding in the old books Mabon kept locked because they frightened her. She had understood exactly what it asked. It asked a life for a life, not given all at once but paid slowly, a debt drawn down across all the years the bound one had left. She had been young. She had thought she had a great many years. She had knelt over his broken body, and she had spoken the words, and she had felt his death lift out of him and settle into her own chest like a stone, dropped into still water, and she had watched him breathe. She remembered the exact moment it took hold. The words had left her mouth, and for one heartbeat, nothing happened, and she had thought herself a fool, a servant girl, mumbling over a corpse. Then the cold had come. It had poured into her, from the wound under her hands, and climbed her arms, and filled her chest, and it had never once left in all the years since she carried the cold of that night in her still. On the worst mornings, she woke to it and lay very still and let herself believe, for just a moment, that she was back on the floor of the great hall, with his blood warm on her wrists and his life balanced on the edge of her breath. It had been the most frightening night of her life. It had also, she could admit to no one, been the only night she had ever felt she mattered. He had lived. He had risen. He had won his war and taken his crown. And because the bond she had made without asking had left a mark on him that he could feel but could not name, He had come looking for the girl whose face he half remembered from that night, and he had made her his Luna in front of the whole of the vile mark, and he had never once known what she had done. She had let him believe it was fate. It was easier to be loved for fate than pitied for a debt. She did not regret it, she told herself, that most days, and believed it on some of them. Now she stood in the council chamber and made herself the picture of a calm Luna while the newcomer was presented to the court, and she learned the woman's name, along with everyone else. Neres of the Sable Line came into the hall like she had been born to walk into halls. She was younger than Isora, by some years, and stronger than Isora had been even before the binding, and there was a brightness to her that made the tired torchlight seem to gather in her direction. She went to one knee before Torin with her head high, which was not how one knelt, and the old counselors who should have frowned at it smiled instead. "Rise," Torin said, and there was a warmth in it that Isara felt in the pit of her stomach. Neres rose. Her eyes went once, quickly, to Isara on the dais, and something passed across them that Isara could not read and did not like. Then the brightness came down over it again like a shutter. "The southern packs send their strongest to the king who held the line," Neres said, and her voice carried without her seeming to raise it. "My father would have me learn the ways of Duncaro. I ask only for a place here." "A place," Torin repeated, and he was already half won. Isora could see it, could see how the loneliness in him leaned toward the sheer, easy life of her. "Then you will have one." The court murmured its pleasure. Osric, standing at the king's shoulder, caught Isara's eye across the hall and did not smile, and Osric almost always smiled at her, and the fact that he did not now told her more than the whole of the ceremony had. Later, when the hall had emptied, Osric found her in the corridor that ran behind the dais where the drafts were worst and the highborn never walked. He was a big, plain, honest man who had followed Torin since they were boys, and he had been kind to her from the first day, in a way that had cost him standing, and she had never forgotten it. "You look tired, Luna," he said, which from Osric was not an insult but a worry. "I am always tired," she said lightly. "It is my one great talent." He did not laugh. He glanced back down the empty corridor, and then he lowered his voice. "Be careful of the southern girl," he said. "There is more sent with her than she has said. I read the letters that came up with her party." He stopped himself, as though he had already said more than his oath allowed. "Just watch her. And, Luna," he hesitated, "whatever it is that ails you, tell him." He is not a man who does well being kept from things. Something in her chest twisted so hard she had to hold the wall. "There is nothing to tell," she said. Osric looked at her for a long moment with his honest, tired eyes, and she understood that he did not believe her, and that he was going to let her keep the lie anyway, because he was decent, and that decency was going to cost them both. That night, when the keep had gone dark and the fires had burned low, there came a knock at the door of Isora's private rooms, soft and unhurried. She opened it, expecting Mabon. It was Neres. The southern girl stood in the corridor with a candle in her hand and her bright face gone strangely still, and she looked at Isora for a moment the way a buyer looks at a thing in a market, weighing it, pricing it. "Forgive the hour," Neres said. "I could not sleep." New walls. She tilted her head, and the candlelight moved in her eyes. "You are not what they told me," she said. "They said the Luna was dying." She let the words sit there in the cold air between them, plain and terrible. "But here you stand." Isora's blood went to ice. "I do not know what you mean," she said. Neres smiled, and it was a lovely smile, and it did not touch anything behind her eyes. "I think you do," she said. "Sleep well, Luna. We will have a great deal to say to one another." And she turned and walked away down the dark corridor with her candle, and Isora stood in her own doorway, with her heart slamming against the stone she had built around it, and understood that the one secret she had guarded for 7 years was already, somehow, not a secret at all. She did not sleep. She sat by her cold hearth until the gray came, turning the same question over and over. How could the southern girl know? Who could have told her? Maven would sooner cut out her own tongue. Osric did not know the truth, only that she was ill, and Torin did not know at all. By morning she had no answer, only a headache and the coppery taste that never fully left her mouth anymore, and a summons. It was Torin himself who sent for her, which was rare enough these days to frighten her. Their marriage had gone quiet in the way of a house where no one says the hard thing. He loved her. She never doubted that he loved her. But he loved her. Across a growing distance, a man reaching for a wife who kept stepping back into the shadows so he would not see how thin her wrists had become. And after 7 years of that, a man learns to stop reaching. She had done that to him on purpose. It did not make it hurt less to see it work. He was in the small solar off his war room, the one with the good south light, and he had sent the servants away, and he stood at the map table with his hands braced on the wood and his head bent, and when she came in he looked up at her, and for one moment, he was not the king. He was only Torin, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the first year, and it undid her a little. "I, Sora," he said. "Come and sit, you are on your feet too much." "I am the Luna," she said. Taking the chair he pulled out, because refusing it would have started a conversation she could not have. "Being on my feet is the whole of the work. Not today," he said. "Today, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth," which he did not seem to hear as the cruelty it was. He came around the table and crouched in front of her chair, so that their eyes were level, which no king should do, and he had always done with her. And he took her hand, and his hand was so warm and so alive that she had to fight to keep her face still. It was the warmth she had been feeding him out of her own body for 7 years, and he thought it was simply his. "The southern packs want an alliance," he said. "A true one. Blood and border, both. Nary's is their price and their gift." He watched her carefully. "The council wants me to take her into the pack in a way that binds the South to us for good. You understand what they mean by that." She understood. She had understood since the moment the girl knelt. "They want you to take her as a second," Izora said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that later, that it did not shake. "A second mate, or more than that. They want a Luna who can give the realm heirs," he said, and there was pain in it, real pain. He was not a careless man. "And they say," and here his jaw tightened, "they say you cannot, that you are failing." He gripped her hand harder. "I told them a great many things about what I think of their opinions on my wife. But I, Sora," he searched her face. "If there is something wrong with you, something real, I need you to tell me now. Because I will burn the whole Southern Alliance to the ground before I set you aside for it. You have only to tell me you want me to." He paused then, and something crossed his face that she did not expect. A flicker of unease he tried to smooth away and could not quite. "The girl came to me last night," he said. "Nary's. Before I sent for you." He turned one of the map pieces over in his fingers without seeming to know he was doing it. "She said a strange thing. She said, I should look closely at my wife before I let the council decide anything, because there were things about the Luna of the Vilemark that a king ought to know from her own mouth, and not from a council's whispers." He looked up. What did she mean? Isora. For one terrible moment the whole of it rose in her throat, the truth and the sickness and the 7 years, all of it pushing to get out. "She is a stranger playing at court," Isora said. "She wants my place, and she is clever enough to make you doubt me to get it. That is all she meant." He watched her a moment longer, and she could not tell whether he believed her, and that was new, and it frightened her in a way the illness never had. For 7 years he had believed everything she told him. She had built her whole survival on it, and there it was. The thing Osric had begged her to do, the thing Maven had begged her not to, the door standing open. All she had to do was say the words, "My love, I am dying. I have been dying for you since the night you should have died for me." And he would gather her up, and it would all come apart, the tether, the secret, the careful, terrible architecture of 7 years. and he would learn that every breath he had taken since the siege had been drawn out of her lungs. And it would break him, and being broken, he would find some way to give it back, and he would die. So she smiled. She had gotten very good at it. "There is nothing wrong with me that a warmer keep would not cure," she said. "Do what is right for the realm, Torin. You are the king before you are my husband. You always were." Something closed in his face. She had wanted it to. It still felt like driving a nail into her own hand. He rose. He let go of her hand. "Very well," he said, and the king was back, and the man was gone. Then he said more quietly, as if to himself, "I had hoped you would fight me on it." She left before she could. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed her sleeve to her mouth. And this time when she took it away, it was bad enough that her knees went, and she slid down the cold stone and sat there on the floor of her husband's house, alone, and did not let herself weep, because weeping cost breath. And breath was the one thing she could no longer spend freely. She did not see Neres standing at the far turn of the corridor, but Neres saw her. Neres saw all of it: the pressed cloth, the shaking hands, the Luna of the veil mark, folded on the floor like a dropped thing. And Neres, watching, began very slowly to smile. She did not come forward. She did not offer help, or call for it, or do any of the things a decent stranger would do. At the sight of a woman folded bleeding on the floor, she only watched and waited until Isora had gathered herself and risen and pressed the ruined cloth out of sight, and then she stepped back around the turn of the corridor so cleanly that Isora, rising, saw nothing but an empty passage and thought herself alone. That was the thing Isora would remember later when she understood everything. Not the cruelty of being watched, the patience of it. Neres had not needed to act, she had only needed to know. And now she knew that the Luna bled in secret, that the king had begun to doubt his wife, and that the strongest woman in Dunkaro was quietly running out of time. A patient enemy is worse than a cruel one. A cruel one shows you the knife. Isora would not learn how patient this one could be until it was far too late to matter. The trouble with a secret is that it wants to be two secrets, and then four. And Isora spent the following days learning how many small lies it took to keep one large one standing. She learned to time her worst hours to the empty parts of the day. She learned which quarters Neres walked and walked the others. She learned to eat when watched and to be sick when not. And through all of it, the court turned, slowly, and then not slowly at all, toward the bright southern girl who laughed easily and rode well and never once had to press a cloth to her mouth in the dark. At the high table, on the second evening, Neres did a small thing that Isora understood at once, and no one else seemed to notice at all. When the platters came, the southern girl waited and watched, and only lifted her own cup after Isara had lifted hers, matching her, mirroring her, learning the shape of a Luna's evening the way a girl learns a dance by standing behind the dancer. She caught Isora watching and did not look away. She raised her cup a little, as if in a toast meant for the two of them alone, and mouthed something across the noise of the hall that Isora read from her lips more than heard. Soon the southern girl said. Isora set down her own cup very carefully so that her hand would not betray her, and smiled at the length of the table and felt the walls of her one secret grow thinner by the hour. Mabon came to her on the third night with a face like a closed door. "I have found the rest of it," the healer said, and set an old cracked book on the table between them, one of the ones she kept locked. "I have been reading of the passing of a binding since the girl arrived, because I did not like the way the wind smelled. Sit, child. You will want to be sitting." Isora sat. "The tether can be moved," Mabon said. "I told you that much. What I did not tell you, because I did not know it yet, is how. It cannot simply be handed over like a cloak. The one who takes it must take it willingly and take it whole, knowing the cost, and there must be blood between the two women." Given freely, Mabon's old hands were not quite steady on the page. "But hear the rest, because the rest is the trap. If the binding is broken, and no one stands ready to catch it, the death does not simply fade. It goes home. It returns to the one it was taken from. To Torin. The instant the tether goes slack with no new back to bear it, the wound of the siege opens in him, as though 7 years had never passed. The room seemed to tilt. So I cannot be freed, Isora said slowly, unless another woman chooses to die in my place. And if I am freed any other way, he dies instead. Yes, Mabon said. And there is a woman in this keep, Isara said, and her own voice sounded strange to her. Far away, a woman who already knows I am dying and who wants my place at his side more than she wants anything in this world. Mabon said nothing. She did not have to. Isora understood then, all at once and completely, the shape of the thing that was closing around her, and it was not the shape she had feared. She had feared being set aside, being replaced, fading out of the world unloved while a stronger woman took her husband and her throne. That fear she could have borne. She had been fading her whole married life. This was worse. This was a door with 2 rooms behind it and death in both. She sat with that for a long while. She had spent 7 years making her peace with dying, and she found now that the peace had been a kind of vanity, because it had always been her own death she was making peace with, and her own death was the one loss in the world she knew how to carry. She had never once let herself imagine outliving him. She had never had to. The whole architecture of the binding had promised her she never would, that his life was pinned to hers and would go out when hers did, that whatever happened they would at least end together in the dark. Now here was a road where she lived, and he did not, where she stepped out of the grave she had dug for him, and the grave simply waited, open, for him to fall into. She would have his warmth back in her own chest and his breath back in her own lungs, and she would have them at the cost of watching the wound of the siege bloom open in his side across a council table while every soul in the hall screamed. She would be strong again and whole again, and she would be strong and whole, standing over his body. She would rather have the coffin. She would rather have the season Mabon had promised her. She understood that about herself now, cleanly, the way you understand a thing you can never again pretend not to know. If Neres took the throne but not the tether, then the day Torin set Isora aside, the day their bond thinned enough to slacken the binding, the death would go home to him and take him in front of the whole court. She would have kept his secret for 7 years only, to hand him back his grave the moment she stepped out of it. But if Neres could be made to take the tether, willingly, whole, with blood freely given, then Isara would live, and Torin would live, and the southern girl who so badly wanted the Luna's place would have it, all of it, the bright half everyone could see and the dying half no one could. Let her have my place, Isora thought, and the thought was so quiet and so total that it did not frighten her at all, and that was the most frightening thing about it. She did not say it aloud, not yet. That would come later, in the great hall, in front of everyone, on the worst and last day. But it was born in her that night, sitting across from Mabon, with the cracked book open between them, and once a thought like that is born, it does not die easily. It grows in the dark, the way she had grown her illness in the dark. Patient and hidden and sure, the candle guttered. Mabon reached across the table and took both of Isara's cold hands in her warm old ones and held them hard. "Do not," the healer said, as if she had heard every word. Isara had not spoken. "I know that face. I have known you since you were a scrap of a girl too frightened to ask for bread, and I know exactly what you are already deciding, and I am telling you, child, there has to be another road than this." Isora looked at their joined hands. She thought of Torin crouching in front of her chair, with his warm hand around hers, saying, "I had hoped you would fight me on it." She thought of 7 winters of borrowed breath. She thought of how much worse the sickness had been that morning than the morning before, and how there would be worse still to come. "Maybe there is another road," she said gently, which was the first lie she had ever told Mabon, and they both knew it. Outside the door, in the dark of the corridor, a candle flame steadied, and then withdrew, soft and unhurried, and neither of the women inside heard the quiet sound of someone who had been listening walk away. The council did not wait long. Powerful men rarely do once they have decided a thing is good for them, and the men of the Veil Mark had decided that a strong young southern bride was very good for them indeed. In the days that followed, Isora watched the shape of her own undoing take form around her with the strange calm of a woman who has already seen the ending. She sat through the sessions where they spoke of her as though she were a chair being replaced, too worn now for the weight it once carried. She heard the word barren said gently, and the word failing said less gently, and she folded her hands in her lap and let them say it, because every hour they spent looking at what she could not give was an hour they did not spend looking at what she was quietly doing. Only Osric fought for her, and he fought badly, because he was an honest man in a room of clever ones. He said she had held the keep steady for 7 winters. He said a Luna was more than a womb. He said once, half rising from his seat, that they did not know the half of what she had given this house. And Isora had gone cold at that, wondering how much Osric had guessed. But he did not know the truth. He only felt it, the way a good dog feels a coming storm, and feeling was not enough to win a room. The worst of it was not the council. The worst of it was Torin. He came to her rooms on the 4th night, unannounced, and he stood in her doorway the way he had stood in it in the first year of their marriage, filling it, uncertain, too large for the small, warm space. He had a cup of the spiced wine she used to like in each hand, which meant he had gone to the kitchens himself, which meant he had sent no servant to see this. I could not sleep, he said, which she knew to be true, and which she alone in all the world knew the reason for, because his sleeplessness and his strength and his very heartbeat all ran on the same thin thread she carried in her chest. She let him in. She should not have. She let him in anyway, because she was going to lose him within the week, and she was weak enough to want 1 more hour first. They sat by her fire, the way they had not sat in years. He told her about a horse that had gone lame, and a bridge in the Low Country that needed mending, and a dozen small, ordinary, kingly things. And she listened and made the small sounds a wife makes, and for a little while it was so much like being happy that she had to keep her eyes on the flames. At some point, his hand found hers on the arm of the chair. He did not lace their fingers. He only rested his hand over hers, warm and heavy and certain, and she looked down at it and thought, that warmth is mine. I have been paying for it every day for 7 years, and I would pay for it every day of 100 more if I had them. Do you remember, he said, the first winter, and there was a rough softness in his voice that she had not heard in a long while. You did not know how to be a Luna. You kept trying to carry your own trays. The kitchen girls did not know whether to laugh or die of the shame of it. He shook his head at the fire. I married a woman who could not stop being useful long enough to be served. Half the court thought I had lost my wits. He turned his head and looked at her, and the firelight moved in his tired eyes. I thought I had found the only honest person in the whole of Duncaro. She had to look back at the flames, because if she looked at him, she would come apart, because he had named the exact thing that was wrong with her, the exact wound, and he had named it as the reason he loved her, and he did not know that it was also the reason she was about to leave him to save his life. You give the court too little credit, she managed. Some of them think I have wits. He laughed, low and short, and the sound of it went into her like warmth into cold hands. Isara, he said, low, if I do this thing they want, his jaw worked. Tell me you understand it is not because I stopped. He could not finish it. He was not a man who said the soft words easily, even when they were true. I understand, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that was almost a question, almost the old reaching, and she felt the truth rise in her throat one final time, and she smiled it back down. Drink your wine, she said gently. It is going cold. He left near dawn. He did not take her hand again. She found Nerys waiting for her the next morning in the herb garden, which no one used in the cold months, which was exactly why Nerys had chosen it. The southern girl sat on the low wall, with her bright face turned up to the weak sun, and she did not pretend surprise, and she did not pretend kindness, and Izora found she almost preferred her for it. "You should not go to his rooms at night," Nerys said, "or let him come to yours. It confuses the men on the council when the wife they are trying to retire looks so very much beloved." She smiled. "It is easier for everyone if you fade quietly. You are so good at fading. It is your one great gift." Isora went very still, because those were nearly Mabon's words, the words she had said of herself, and hearing them in this bright, cruel mouth felt like being read from a page. "You listened at the door," Isora said. "3 nights ago, in the healer's room." Nerys tilted her head. "I listen everywhere," she said. "It is how a girl with no bond and no name and no army makes herself worth a kingdom." She slid down from the wall and came close. Close enough that Izora could see there was no malice in her, only hunger, which was worse. "I know what you are, Luna. I know what you did in the Great Hall 7 winters ago, and I know what it is costing you, and I know it can be moved." She let the word sit, moved to another back. For one wild instant, Isora's whole desperate plan lit up in front of her. Here was the willing woman. Here was the one who wanted the place. If Nerys would only take the tether with it, then Torin would live and Isora would live, and the girl could have her crown, and her cold ambition, and the slow death that came with them. "Take it then," Isara said, and she heard the terrible eagerness in her own voice. "Take all of it. The place, the crown, him. Only take the whole of the place, not the bright half alone. Take the binding with the throne, and I will stand up in that hall myself, and put your hand in his." And Nerys laughed. She laughed like a bell, clear and delighted, and the sound of it told Isora the last thing she needed to know. "Take the dying," Nerys said, wiping her eye. "Oh, you poor thing. No, I want the throne. I want the king and the crown, and the long bright life." She stepped back, still smiling. "You may keep the dying. You are so very good at it." She turned and walked back toward the warm keep. And Isora stood alone in the dead garden, and understood, at last, and completely, that there was no door left that did not have his death behind it, except one, and it was hers to open. They set her aside on a gray morning in the great hall of Duncaro, in front of the whole assembled court, and it was done with more ceremony than cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Isara wore her finest gown, the deep red one, because if she was to be unmade in front of these people, she would not give them a pale and trembling thing to remember. Mabon had dressed her hair. Mabon's old hands had shaken the whole time, and Isora had pretended not to notice, and neither of them had spoken, because there was nothing left to say that would not have ended in one of them breaking. The hall was full. She counted the faces without meaning to, the way a drowning woman counts the shore, the counselors in their heavy chains, the warriors along the walls. Osric, at the foot of the dais, with his jaw set like stone, and his eyes fixed on some point above her head, because he could not make himself look at her directly. And on the high seat, Torin, in the black and silver of the crown, looking down at her with a face he had spent all night learning how to hold. The walk to the dais was long. It was the same floor she had crossed 10,000 times, and it had never once felt so wide. Her steps sounded very loud in the hush. Somewhere near the middle of that walk, her body chose to betray her, a small treacherous catch, low in her chest, that wanted to become a cough. And she swallowed it whole and kept her chin level and did not slow, because she would sooner have died on that floor than let the watching court see the fading Luna falter on her way to be set aside. She reached the dais at last. She stopped. She folded her hands. She waited, the picture of a woman at peace, while inside her the swallowed cough burned like a coal, and the tether hummed its warm, oblivious song. Nerys stood a little apart, off to the side where the light was good, radiant and patient, waiting for the room to be handed to her. Torin spoke the words, "A king speaks." They were old words, worn smooth by other kings and other unmakings, words about the good of the realm and the strength of the blood and the hard duties of a crown. Isora did not hear most of them. She watched his mouth make the shapes, and she felt the thin thread between them, the tether humming with his living warmth, and she thought, "This is the last time I will stand close enough to feel it clearly. When I am gone from here it will stretch thin. I will have to pull his warmth to me across all the miles. And it will be harder, and it will hurt, and I will do it anyway, until it finishes me, because a stretched thread that holds is better than a cut one that kills him." That was her plan. That was the whole of the terrible arithmetic she had worked out alone in the dead garden. She could not stay, for staying beloved would keep the council circling and might yet drag the truth into the light. She could not let the bond be cut, for cutting it sent his death home. So she would go. She would go far and go quietly, and carry his death out of his house on her own back. And she would keep carrying it from the shadows of some distant place until her body gave out. And if she timed the giving out well enough, if she let herself finish the tether all the way to its natural end before it ever snapped from the strain of distance, then the death would have nowhere to go home to. It would end where she ended, and he would simply live. He would never know. That was the gift. He would think he had set aside a fading wife for a strong one, and gotten lucky in his health, and he would grow old, strong, and warm and blameless. And somewhere far away, a woman he had half forgotten would have spent her last breath, making sure of it. Let her have the throne, Isora thought, watching Nereus stand in her patch of good light. Let her have the crown and the bright loud half of it. That was never my place anyway. My place is the other thing. My place is the dying. And that I will keep. Torin finished the words. The hall went quiet. And then he did the one thing she had not braced for, because it was not in the old ceremony, because it was purely and only him. He looked down at her and his voice dropped, so that it was almost for her alone, and he said, "Isora, if there is any reason this should not be done, any reason at all, speak it now, and I will send every soul in this hall home, and let them think what they like." The whole court held its breath. Osric's head came up. Mabon, at the edge of the hall, pressed her knuckles white against her mouth. And Isora understood that he was giving her the door. He was standing in front of the entire veil mark, and quietly, desperately offering to burn it all down if she would only give him a reason. All she had to do was tell the truth. "My love, I am the reason you breathe. Cut this and you cut your own throat." He would believe her. He would take her back before the whole court and to the grave with her. And he would die of it, if not today, then the day the guilt taught him how to give the tether back. The truth rose in her the way a cough rose in her throat, unbidden, insistent, wanting out. She felt it press against her teeth. She thought of the fireside 2 nights before, his warm, heavy hand over hers, the rough softness in his voice when he spoke of the first winter. She thought of how easy it would be, how one sentence would end the loneliness of 7 years, of carrying this alone, how she could set the whole terrible weight down, right here on this cold stone floor, and let him pick up his half of it at last. For one heartbeat, she wanted it so badly that she swayed on her feet. Then she thought of what would come after, not the tears, not the forgiveness. The morning 3 days later, or 3 months, when he had turned it over enough times to understand that every breath he took was stolen from her lungs, and could not bear it, and went looking through Mabon's burned books for the words to give it back. She had saved him from a spear 7 winters ago. She would not now hand him a knife and call it honesty. So she gave him the only mercy she had left, which was a lie, wearing the shape of grace. She smiled at him. She smiled the way she had smiled through 7 years of it, warm and steady and complete, and she said, clear enough for the whole hall to hear, "Then let her have my place." For a moment no one moved. The words were gracious. The words were perfect. They were exactly the words a noble wife was supposed to say, and almost never had the heart to, and the hall received them the way a hall receives a thing it has been hoping for and did not dare expect. She heard the soft rustle of approval move through the counselors like wind through dry grass. She saw one old man actually bring his hands together, quietly, as though at the close of a fine song. Only two people in that hall did not look pleased. Mabon, at the edge, closed her eyes and turned her face to the wall. And Osric, standing just below the dais, looked at Isara with a slow dawning horror because he had heard something in the shape of the word place that the clever men around him had not. Some weight on it that did not belong to a simple surrender of a crown, and he did not understand it, and it frightened him all the same. She saw it land on him. She saw Torrin take it as surrender, as peace, as a wife stepping graciously aside for the good of the realm, which was every part of what the hall heard and no part of what she meant. She saw the fight go out of him, and something in his shoulders drop, half relief and half grief, and she thought, there, it is done. He thinks I have let him go, when I have only picked up the whole weight of him and turned to carry it out the door. The court exhaled. The ceremony moved on around her, like water around a stone. Neres stepped into her patch of light and into the place at the king's side, and the counselors smiled, and it was finished. Only later, alone in his chambers when the hall had emptied and the new bright Luna had been toasted and led away, did Torrin press a hand to the center of his own chest and frown. Because for the first time in 7 winters, in the place under his ribs, where he had never once thought to notice warmth, because it had simply always been there, he felt the smallest thread of cold. He did not know what it was. He rubbed at it, and it faded, and he told himself it was the gray morning, and the hard duty, and the wine. He would remember it later. He would remember it for the rest of his life. Isara left Dunkero before the next dawn, on foot, in a plain gray cloak. The way she had first come to it as a nameless girl, so that the ending would match the beginning and no one would think to stop a servant slipping out the postern gate. Mabon came with her as far as the river. The old healer had argued all night, had wept, had threatened, had at the last simply walked beside her, in silence through the dark fields, with a pack of dried root and clean cloth on her back, because if she could not stop the girl, she would at least send her out fed and tended. At the river, she took Isara's face in both hands. One final time. There has to be another road, Mabon said, for the 100th time, and for the 100th time. It was not true, and they both knew it. You gave me the road, Isara said gently. 7 winters ago. I only have to walk to the end of it. I gave you a book, Mabon said, and her voice cracked. I begged you not to read it. She pressed her forehead to Isara's for a moment. Hard, the way she had when Isara was small and frightened of the dark. Then, listen to me now, since you would not listen. Then, the tether does not like distance, child. It was made close, in blood, hand to wound. Stretch it far enough, and it does not stretch forever. It frays. And if it frays through before you have spent yourself to the natural end, it will not simply break gentle. It will snap, and the death will go home to him faster than a rider, and there will be nothing either of us can do to catch it. She gripped harder, so do not wander, do not linger over it. Whatever you mean to do, you have not the time you think you have. Weeks, not the season I gave you, weeks. Isara had known somewhere that leaving would cost her time. Hearing the number made her knees weak all the same. She had thought she would have the mercy of a slow going, of choosing her last hour. She would not. She had walked out the gate and started a clock she could not see the face of. She went east, into the high pine country, where the packs were poor and thin, and asked no questions of a quiet woman who paid in silver and coughed in the night. She took a room over a smith's forge in a town, too small to have a name worth remembering. And there, for the first time in her whole life, Isara was no one's servant and no one's Luna and no one's secret, and she found the freedom of it unbearable. She had never once wondered who she was apart from what she gave. As a girl, she had been the hands that fetched and carried. Useful, therefore allowed to stay. As a woman, she had been the death that saved a king, useful, therefore loved. She had built her entire small life out of usefulness, the way another woman builds a house out of stone, and now she sat in a bare room over a forge, with nothing to fetch and no one to save yet, and no crown to hold, and she felt herself begin to disappear in a way that had nothing to do with the binding. This is what I am worth, she thought, watching her own thin hands in the firelight, when I am not spending myself on someone. Nothing. A cough, and a cloak, and a room I have already paid for. It frightened her more than the dying did. She could face the dying. The dying had a purpose. It was the small, terrible thought underneath it that she could not face. The thought that had lived in her since the castle steps where she was left as a babe. The thought that said you were never wanted for yourself, only for your use. And when the use is spent, you will be set down and forgotten, and that is only right. Because there was never anything else to you. Mabon, had she been there, would have taken her by the shoulders and shaken her, and told her it was a lie, the oldest and cruelest lie the girl had ever swallowed. But Mabon was not there. Isora had left her at the river on purpose, because a witness would have tried to save her, and she did not want saving. She wanted him to live. Far to the west, in the warm, bright heart of Duncarrow, the king was not living well. It had begun the night of the ceremony, with that thread of cold under his ribs, and it had not gone away. It came and went now like a tide, and on its worst nights, it was not a thread at all, but a whole cold hand, laid flat against the inside of his chest, and he would wake from it, gasping, with no wound, to show for the pain of it. Nerys lay beside him in the great bed, the new Luna, strong and bright and everything the council had promised, and the bond between them was a clean new thing, correct in every way, and it warmed him not at all. He had begun to understand slowly that the warmth he had carried all his life, and never once questioned, had walked out of his keep in a grey cloak, and that he had opened the gate for it himself, and thanked it for going. He found himself in her empty rooms more than once. He did not tell anyone. He stood in the cold hearth smell of them, and could not have said what he was looking for. Osric found him there on the 5th night and said nothing, only stood in the doorway with his honest face full of a grief he did not dare name, and at last the king said, "Lo, to the empty room. Where did she go, Osric?" And Osric, who did not know, and who had begun to suspect something so terrible he could not make his mouth form it, said only, "I will find out, my king. I will find her." At night, the tether pulled. She had thought she was ready for it, and she was not. Across all those miles of dark pine it drew at the thread in her chest, like a hook set in something soft, dragging his warmth toward her a little at a time, and it hurt in a way the close binding never had, a deep wrong strain as though her ribs were being asked to breathe for a body that was not there. Each night it took a little more to hold it. Each morning, she woke a little further gone, her hands a little thinner, the weight in her chest a little heavier. She counted the days by the cloth. On the 9th night, she coughed until she could not stand, and she lay on the floor of the little room, feeling the tether shudder along its whole length, feeling it strain and thin, feeling how close it had already come to the fraying Mabon had warned of. And she understood that she did not have weeks after all. She had days, perhaps very few of them. So be it, she thought, lying on the cold floor with the firelight swimming above her. Then I will finish it before it can snap. I will give the last of myself all at once, and of my own free will, and carry the whole of his death down into the dark with me, where it can never find its way back to his door. It should have frightened her, deciding the hour of her own ending on a stranger's floor in a town with no name. It did not. What frightened her was how little there was to weigh against it. A woman with a full life does not give it up easily, because there are hands that will go cold without hers to hold them, chairs that will sit empty, a whole warm web of people who will feel the tear when she goes. Isora lay very still and looked for her web and could not find it. Mabon, who had begged her not to do this and would grieve, and him who must never know she had done it at all. That was the whole of it. That was the sum of a life spent being useful to everyone and known by no one. She had made herself so easy to set down that now at the end there was almost nothing to hold her. And yet, lying there, spending what she had left, counting the reasons she had none, she found she was not sorry. She would do the thing she had come to do. She would just have liked, once, before the dark, to have been wanted for something other than what she could give. She did not weep. Weeping cost breath. She lay very still instead, and made her peace, and far away in Dunchero, in the deep of that same ninth night, an alpha king woke gasping in a bed that was not hers, with a cold like a blade sliding between his ribs, and clutched at his own chest, and did not understand, and began at last, 7 winters too late, to be afraid. By the 9th day after the ceremony, the king of the Valemark could no longer hide that he was dying. It had come on the way winter comes, a little colder each morning, until one day the whole world has changed, and no one can say which night it happened. Torin woke gray. His hands, which had crushed shields, shook over his morning cup. The old healers who had once whispered that the former Luna was failing, now bent over the new king with the same frightened faces, and found nothing, because there was nothing in his body to find. The wound was not in his body. It was 7 winters and many miles away, fraying. Osric watched it happen, and could bear it no longer. He went to Mabon. He found the old woman in her locked room among her jars, and he did not knock, and he did not soften it. He shut the door behind him and set his back against it so she could not leave. And he said, "You know what ails him. You have known since the day he began to fade. I have served that man since we were boys, and I will not stand in a corner and watch him die, of a thing that has a name. Tell me the name." Mabon looked at him for a long while. She was very old and very tired, and she had kept this secret so long it had grown into her like a root, and she found, looking at Osric's honest broken face, that she no longer had the strength to keep it against a man who loved the king as plainly as she loved the girl. So she told him all of it, the siege and the servant girl, on her knees beside him, the forbidden words, the death lifted out of the young Alpha and carried away in a body no one ever thought to look at twice. She told him what the tether was, and what it had cost, across 7 years, and why the Luna had always been pale, and always been tired, and had never carried an heir, because there was no room in a body already carrying a death for it to also make a life. And she told him the last of it, the part that made Osric's knees go, that Isora had gone east, to give the last of herself, all at once, of her own choosing, and carry the whole of the king's death away with her, so it could never come home, and that she was very likely already close to the end of it, and that if the fraying tether snapped before she finished, the death would come home to Torin faster than any rider could ride. Osric did not waste breath on grief. He turned and wrenched the door open and went to find his king, and Mabon came behind him as fast as her old legs would carry her, and they found Torin in the empty rooms again, the cold ones that still smelled faintly of her, sitting on the floor with his back against her cold hearth, like a man who had crawled home to die in the only place that had ever been warm. Osric knelt in front of him and told him everything, quickly, plainly, the way you tell a man a thing when there is no time to be gentle. And Torin listened, and Osric watched the knowing come into his face in stages, watched it move through him like the cold moved through him, and watched it arrive at last at the thing he had said in the great hall, the words he had taken for grace. "Then let her have my place." "My place," Torin said. His voice did not sound like his own. She did not mean the throne. He looked up at Osric with the eyes of a man who has just seen the floor of his whole life fall away. "She never meant the throne. She stood in front of the entire court and told me exactly what she was doing, and let me thank her for it. Her place." He pressed the heel of his hand hard against the center of his chest, against the cold. "Her place was here. Her place was standing between me and the grave, And I opened the gate, and I set her aside, and I told her it was for the good of the realm, and she smiled at me. Osric. She smiled and she picked it up, and she carried it out my own front gate. He got to his feet. The dying man was gone. What stood up in that cold room was something older and harder, the thing that had ended the War of the Passes, and it turned its terrible new attention on the one question that was left. Where, he said. He found Neres in the great hall, in the good light, wearing the crown that had been Isora's, and he crossed the whole length of that hall, in a silence so total that the court fell back from him like water. He did not raise his hand to her. He did not need to. He only stood in front of her and looked at her and asked her, low, whether she had known. And Neris, who was brave in her way, and who had gambled everything on the belief that a woman like Isora would go on, quietly saving a man from the far side of the world forever, made the mistake of trying to explain. She would have kept you alive, Neris said. She always meant to. I only wanted the place she was leaving empty anyway. I did not think she would. She did not finish. She did not have to. Torin had heard the one word that mattered, which was known, and he turned from her as though she had already ceased to exist. And in a way she had. He gave 3 orders as he walked out of the hall. That the southern woman be sent back to her father's border before nightfall, that his horse be saddled, that Mabon be lifted into a cart with every book she owned and brought behind him as fast as wheels would allow. Then he rode east. He tore through the low country like a storm coming down off the mountains. He did not sleep, because the cold would not let him, and he did not rest the horse until it dropped, and then he took another. He emptied the treasury of remounts along the eastern road. He woke pack leaders in the dead of night, and put his gray, shaking hands on their collars, and made them turn out every soul under their roofs to search. And the story of the king who was tearing his own realm apart for the woman he had cast aside ran ahead of him faster than he could ride it. He rode into every nameless town in the pine country and hammered on doors, and described a quiet woman with tired eyes, who paid in silver and coughed in the night. And for 2 days the answer was always no, and each day the cold in his chest bit deeper and his hands shook worse on the reins. And he understood, without being told, that he was not only riding to find her, he was riding the fraying of the thread itself. Somewhere ahead of him it was coming apart, one strand at a time, and he was trying to reach the far end of it before it let go for good. On the 3rd night, in a town too small to have a name of its own, a frightened smith pointed up a narrow stair to a room above his forge, and said the grey woman had not come down in 2 days, and that he had heard her fall in the night and had been too afraid to look. Torin took the stairs 3 at a time on legs that would barely hold him, and through the door, and found her. She was on the floor by the dead fire, where she had lain for 2 days, so thin now that she hardly moved the blanket someone had thrown over her, her lips gone gray, her breath a thread as fine as the one in her chest. She was not gone. She was so close to gone that the difference hardly had a name. And even now, even here, at the very end of spending herself, her whole ruined body was still turned toward the west, toward him, still holding, still carrying, still pouring the last of her own life west, across the dark, to keep a heart beating in a keep she would never see again. Torin fell to his knees in the cold ash beside her and gathered her up, and her eyes came open and she saw who it was. And the first thing she did, the very first thing, was try to smile. No, she breathed. You have to go. If you are here when it finishes, it will find you. You have to go. And Torin, holding the whole light weight of his own life in his arms, said, No. Not this time. This time, you are going to let me carry it. Mabon's cart came up the mountain road 3 hours behind a king, and Osric carried the old woman up the narrow stair in his arms, because she was shaking too hard to climb, and when she saw the 2 of them on the floor, by the dead fire, she began at once, through her tears, to tell them the only thing she had come all this way to say. It cannot be cut, she said, dragging the cracked book open on the boards, with hands that would not stay still. Do you hear me, both of you? It cannot be cut. If she lets go and there is no one holding it, it goes to you, Torin, and you are a living man now, and not a corpse on a floor. And it will still kill you. It will open the old wound as though the 7 years never were. And if you take it from her whole, all of it the same. One body cannot hold a whole death and live. One of you dies. That is the only ending this thing has ever had. That is why I begged her never to begin it. Torin looked down at Isora in his arms. She was fighting him even now, too weak to push him away with her hands, so pushing him away with words, telling him to go, telling him she had chosen this, telling him it was hers to give, and he had no right to take it from her, and under all of it, threaded through all of it, the old wound he had never understood until this moment. The girl left on the castle steps. The servant who had learned that the only way to be allowed to stay was to be useful. The woman who could not imagine being wanted for anything but what she could give. "Let me do this," she was saying. "Let me be worth this one thing. It is the only thing I have ever been good for. Let me give it to you." And Torin finally understood what she needed, which was not to be saved. "Isara," he said, and he took her gray face in his two shaking hands the way Mabon used to, and he made her look at him. "Listen to me. I did not ride across the whole realm to take your gift. I wrote it because I do not want it." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I do not want the years you can buy me. I do not want the warmth you can pour into me. I never wanted the thing you could give me. I have spent 7 winters loving the woman who kept trying to carry her own trays, and I was too proud and too blind to tell her, and I let a room full of clever men tell me she was worth less than what she could produce, and I believed them, and it nearly cost me the only true thing I have ever had. I do not want what you can give me, Isora." He was weeping now, the king who never wept. "I want you, alive, useless, empty-handed, with nothing left to give me, and no reason to stay but that I am asking you to. That is the only thing I have ever wanted, and I was too great a fool to say it until I had to say it on a floor." She stared at him. In 7 years, no one had ever said such a thing to her. In her whole life, no one had ever said it. She had built her entire self on the certainty that it could not be said, and here it was said, and the foundation of the old lie cracked straight down the middle. And Mabon, watching, saw the one thing change that she had not dared to hope for, and understood the book had been wrong, or rather, that the book had only ever been written by people who tried to carry the thing alone. "It needs a holder," the old woman whispered. "It cannot live in empty air." She had said it once before, in a locked room as a warning. She said it now as a prayer. It goes to whoever holds it. But she never let anyone hold it with her. No one ever offered. Torin heard her. He looked up. "Then we hold it together," he said. Mabon made a sound that was half protest and half wonder, because in all the years she had studied the binding, she had never once read of it being shared, and she understood now that this was not because it was impossible, but because no one had ever loved anyone enough to try. The binding had always been a thing done in secret by one person, for another, in the dark. It had never been offered back. It had never been held by 2 hands that both knew the cost, and both reached for it anyway. There was no page for that, there had never needed to be one. Because it had never happened. Because it required 2 people willing to die for each other in the same moment, and the world did not make many of those. He did not ask Isora's leave, because she would not have given it. She was still fighting him, still breathing out the word go on a thread of air, still trying with the last of her strength to turn her face west and away from him, so the thing in her chest would not see him and come for him. He gathered her fully against his chest, instead, against the place where the cold had been biting since the night he set her aside, and he pressed her there where she could not turn away, and he reached down that thin fraying thread with everything he was. Not to take it from her, the way Mabon had feared, not to leave it with her, the way she was begging him to, but to seize it in the middle, both hands, and hold it there beside her hands, so that for the first time, the death that had only ever ridden one back sat across two, and it tore into him. He heard himself cry out, and the sound frightened Osric in the doorway more than any wound he had ever seen the king take, because Osric had never once heard Torin make a sound like that. The old wound bloomed in his side like a struck match, 7 years of held agony arriving all at once, and he felt it try to open him the way it had tried to open him on the floor of the great hall the night he should have died. His vision went white, his arms wanted to let go. Every animal part of him screamed to drop the thread and live. He held it. He held it the way he had held the line at the War of the Passes, past the point where holding made sense, past the point where his body agreed to it, because on the other side of the thread was the one true thing and he would not, this time, let go of it, to save himself. But it was not a whole death anymore. It was a death asked to be 2 deaths at once, split down the middle between a dying woman who would not let go and a living king who would not let her carry it alone. Par. And a half of a death is not enough to kill a whole and living man, and it was not enough, quite, to finish a woman who suddenly, for the first time in her life, had been given a reason to hold on that was larger than her usefulness. And that was the thing that saved her, not the splitting alone. The reason. For 7 years Izora had carried his death gladly, because it was the one thing that made her worth keeping. And a woman who thinks she is only worth what she carries will carry a thing all the way into the grave. But he had just knelt in the ash and told her he wanted her empty-handed, wanted her with nothing left to give, wanted only her. And somewhere down under the pane, a small, cold door that had been shut since the castle steps came open, and behind it was the one thing she had never once had in her whole life, which was a reason to stay that asked nothing of her at all. She felt his fingers close over the thread beside hers. And Isora, who had spent her whole life letting go, who had made an art and a virtue and a slow death out of letting go, did the hardest thing she had ever done. She held on. The fire that was not a fire burned down between them, halving and halving again, 2 willing backs bowing under a weight that had been made for one and could not master 2, until what was left of it was not a death at all, but only a long deep scar, laid through the both of them, matched side to side, his and hers. The shape of a thing survived. When it was over they were both alive, barely, wrecked and gray, and clinging to one another on the floor of a nameless room, breathing, which neither of them should have been able to do. Mabon knelt over them sobbing and laughing at once, and pressing her hands to their faces to be sure of them. And Osric stood in the doorway with his back against the frame, and wept openly and was not ashamed. Isora lay in the circle of the king's arms, and felt, for the first time in 7 winters, warmth flow the other way. Taff felt his life come into her the way hers had gone into him for so long, felt the tether hum now in 2 directions at once, no longer a debt running one way into the dark, but a bond running both ways in the light. She turned her ruined face up to his. "I have nothing left to give you," she whispered. It was still, underneath everything, the only fear she truly had. "Good," Torin said, and held her tighter. "Then, you will finally have to let me give something to you." The scar did not heal all at once, and neither did anything else. Isaura was a long time getting her strength back. The death had been split, not undone, and the half she still carried had cost her 7 years. She could not buy back, so there were mornings that spring when she woke, tired to the bone and could not rise. Torin learned, slowly and clumsily, how to care for a woman who had spent her whole life refusing to be cared for, and how to do it without ever letting her turn it into a debt. He was not always good at it. He was a warrior and a king, and gentleness did not come easily to his hands, but he was there. Every morning she could not rise, he was there, and he never once made her feel that being unable to give him anything made her worth less to him, until at last she began to believe it. They took back the crown without ceremony. Neris was gone to the south, and the council, having watched their king ride out half dead for the woman they had told him to discard, had learned that their opinions on his wife were no longer wanted. Isara returned to Duncaro as quietly as she had left it, and this time no one mistook the quiet for weakness. Mabon burned the last of the old books that summer, and Isora, who had once read them in the dark and thought herself worthless enough to spend, helped her feed the pages to the fire one page at a time. And on a morning near the end of that first year, Isara stood again at the high window that looked down on the training yard, one hand resting on the cold stone sill, and watched the king move through the sparring line the way weather moves through a valley. He was strong again. He would outlast every stone in the keep. But now she stood there with both hands empty and warm, no cloth hidden in her sleeve, no sickness, no secret pouring quietly out of her to keep him on his feet. The strength down in the yard was truly his own, given back to him, and hers was truly her own. At last, he looked up, as he always did now, having learned to look for her. He found her in the window, and Isora smiled down at him. And for the first time in the whole long tale of the two of them, the smile cost her nothing at all.